Well, hello everyone. Here we are at OCC on the week of the COVID. I don't really know how often we're going to have to do these online lectures, but I went ahead and just recorded this one because there's some information in there that might be useful than just going through the PowerPoint itself. I hope you can hear it okay. I've got it at full recording volume, so I may have either just ruptured your eardrums just now if you're wearing headphones, or I might be hard to hear depending on the device you're using. So you can pause this at any time, of course, and take notes if you wish to, or go back, and I suppose that's the nice part about doing a recorded lecture. Anyway, we're at that point where we're talking about what happens as the Napoleonic War ends. And the Napoleonic War ends, Napoleon's going to be leaving his position because he's imprisoned twice. And when he's imprisoned, what happens is that Europe, from Poland all the way over to France, are going to have to retool themselves. They have to decide what to do, because one of the major reforms that Napoleon did that upset the balance of order in Europe and all the ancient regimes was that he gave that, what do you call it? I'm in class. I'm looking at you guys, but no one can see me, so I can't have them help me out here. But it's that merit system. Napoleon took that merit system and made it part of all the nations of which he was in control of. And the merit system allowed people of the common classes to have positions of power and lessened the power of the nobility. It's part of his version of the French Revolution brought to Europe. And so with Napoleon gone, there's going to be a lot of people who want to replace the old system. Many of the nobility want that power back that they had. And then, of course, the common people might actually fight a little bit to try to retain the new power that Napoleon forced the governments of Europe to give to them. And so we have a lot of isms, which has to do with the new political systems that are now going to be breaking out throughout Europe. And that's what this is about. So here we go. First one, just some notes for you. After the Napoleonic era ended, Central Europe needed to restructure. We have that one there. And just mentioned that. So the second part is this. Those interested in promoting the changes Napoleon ushered in were called liberals. If you look up liberal in the dictionary, it's not quite what you would see if you look up American politics or look at Facebook or Twitter as people argue about the differences between American liberalism or American conservatism. They're completely different things in the sense of what they basically mean as they begin to exist in Europe after the Napoleonic era. So what we're talking about then is that liberalism has to do, again, with a dictionary interpretation with basically people that embrace change. And then there's some additional concepts to that. Embrace change for, and then depending on the liberal you talk to, for the greater good, or change for a specific group of people. Sometimes liberalism might have to do with progressive change, actually doing things that are radically different than usual. But basically, we have all of those happening in Europe at this time. Okay, so basically the difference for our class for this period of history is that liberals are those who are interested in promoting some of the changes that Napoleon made, basically giving some power to those who are not nobles. And then, of course, there were conservatives. And the conservatives were generally the monarchists and sometimes the peasants, because the peasants were generally, managed directly by the monarchies. And so the very top and the very bottom of society tended to want to return back to the idea of divine right monarchies. And we could talk in class, if we get to have one again, about why peasants were on the side of kings and monarchies and nobles, right? Whereas the middle classes were on the side of liberalism at the time. That's kind of a weird idea. And so it's worth talking about. Maybe we'll have that chance. Anyway, if we move forward, here you go. Generally, the middle classes argued for liberalism. Usually that had to do with market changes, okay? The bourgeoisie is part of the middle class, for instance, while landed nobility promoted conservatism. And so you're going to have class warfare, and hybrid systems throughout Europe are now going to be created as people are fighting for different rights. Okay, so what does this look like? It starts with the Congress of Vienna, which is where the nobles of Europe met to basically reset the map. All right. Now, before we go there, you have an assignment on Canvas. And that assignment is two things. One of them is you writing down from the textbook. These are for two different chapters. You're going to be looking up the changes that Napoleon brought to Europe. All right. basically look for the Napoleonic reforms. That way you'll understand how those reforms are going to basically transition into the fighting between the classes after Napoleon is gone. And so this is the second chart that I want you to do, which is the first one is about Napoleonic reforms. This chart, these are the different forms of isms that we're going to be talking about here. Want to know basically, it comes right out of these slides, so I made it easy. All right, so conservatism, who was really the big focusers on that? What did conservatism want? Liberalism, who were the people really focused on that, and what did they want? Romanticism, French socialism, and Marxist socialism. That's right, folks. This is the period of time where Marxism is going to make its appearance, okay? So, Congress of Vienna, 1814 is about when the Congress starts to meet. And it's just these nobles throughout Europe who get together, not for warfare for once, but they're getting together to decide, well, what do we do now? Okay? And one of the big questions was, what do we do with Central Europe, where Napoleon had taken that German group and, all that Holy Roman Empire and made it its own basic territory during his reign, which means that the people in that region we know as Germany were kind of used to being one group now, and all of a sudden Europe is going to come in and try to basically break it apart again like it's always been. And so that's going to be an issue. Here are the groups that are really meeting in the Congress of Vienna: Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain, the big powers of the time. Okay, they make this treaty and they put back the boundaries of France to where they were just before the revolution really got started. And they're going to put basically a puppet ruler from the original Bourbon dynasty, the same dynasty as the Louis, the same one of that you had King Louis and Marie Antoinette, right, ruling during the revolution, or at the start of the revolution. So these guys are put back in power. You can imagine how annoyed the French people were with that, but they don't get a choice. They're not going to be asked what they want to do. Okay, so there we go. No indemnity. That basically means that that nobody is going to pay for anything. There's not going to be anybody saying we owe somebody for this, and it's also the idea that France is not going to be forced to pay for the war or anything like that. It's basically saying we're just going back to the way it was. Okay, so let's talk about the Metternich system. All right, this is the beginning. This is an Austrian guy, Metternich, and Metternich, and he's going to be creating the system that Europe is going to try to run itself by afterwards. It's not going to work everywhere. All right. This is the old way coming back, all right? Austria, Prussia, and Russia are basically going to try to get rid of Napoleonic changes and any liberal ideas that came from Napoleon in the nations that we're looking at, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. So there are places where liberals are going to create governments, and those governments will be based off of revolutionary ideas that the French and actually, frankly, the Americans would be supportive of, would be used to. And so Spain and Sicily, which was broken into two little nations at the time, are going to successfully create liberal governments. And what's going to happen is this thing called the Holy Alliance, which is, again, let me name them, Russia, Prussia, and Austria are going to send armies in to stop it. Okay? So basically we're back in the system where we were during the Protestant Revolution. Protestant groups are trying to break free when we go back to the 1600s and create their own religion and breaking free from Catholic Europe and Catholic European rule. And then you have the Spanish Empire or whoever going in to try to stop it. Okay, so this is a similar idea where you have conservative regimes in Europe, especially of the big three Central European nations, who are saying we will not allow changes to our system. We're going to put it back to where it was. We liked it that way. We had all the power that way, and therefore we have this quote-unquote Holy Alliance that is going to do everything possible, even sending in armies to put down liberal groups who are trying to change Europe into a different way. Okay, so one of the places that is going to be the most affected by Metternich's policies is the German Confederation that was set up by Napoleon. The Germans are going to be basically split up again, and it's done by the Carlsbad Decrees right here, Carlsbad Decrees issued in 1819. And Germany, as opposed to being hundreds of states like it was before Napoleon, or one state, roughly, like it was under Napoleon, the Germanies are now going to be split up into 38 separate states, basically ruled by Austria and by Prussia. And that's it, right? So that's what's going to happen. This is an issue because the people in Germany are starting to want to get together, perhaps, right? They're starting to think about some kind of German movement. And so that's going to be one of these isms as we move forward. Okay. Metternich and conservatism. How is he a conservative and how did he promote conservative values? Well, he represents the view that the best state blended monarchy, bureaucracy, and aristocracy, together. So the best kind of nation in Metternich's conservative views were that if you took a monarchy, put it together with a good, solid bureaucracy of nobles, and then you have an aristocratic land ownership, just basically the old way, but done efficiently, then you've got a good system that rules people. And he's going to, of course, claim that liberalism stirred up the lower classes and caused war and bloodshed. If there's a problem in Europe, if people are fighting in Europe, if people are supporting Napoleonic principles or even American revolutionary ideals that are based on things like John Locke and philosophies like Locke or Rousseau or Montesquieu or others, then really they're the ones causing the trouble. And if this sounds like the kind of arguing people do today over who is responsible for violence or bad policies, it's either the libs or it's either the conservatives or whatever, you're not wrong, okay? These people are arguing like this back then and they argue like this now. It's just humans picking tribes, okay? All right, so the empire, the German Empire especially, which is not really an empire, we're looking at Austria, which is ruling part of Germany. The Austrian Empire, which was dominated by a lot of Germans, contained many ethnic groups, including these guys, Hungarians, Czechs, and Polish, really. And so there's a lot of people that are kind of arguing for their ethnic independence within Western Austria. That, again, includes part of what is now Germany. Okay. So I'm going to just show this to you, the advent of isms. And here's your German region that's being split up into 38 different groups with Prussia at the very top. They get to maintain their own kingdom now. And then you've got Austria, which has claimed a good portion of Germany right there. France has been put back to its own borders and is being ruled again by a king, a Bourbon king. And we have these kingdoms of Sardinia right here that tried to create a type of liberal government, as did Spain. Okay, so here we go. Let's move forward. Ages of isms. Let's basically try to understand this. Congress of Vienna begins the return of conservative European governments. All right. And then you're going to have the Carlsbad decrees, which basically splits up Germany again. All right. You then have multiple congresses coming in who are going to be trying to promote those conservative ideas over time. There is a massacre where there's going to be people in Peterloo that are going to fight against the idea of conservative governments. They're trying to create a liberal system. All right, you've got a revolt that happens. These are all in your books, okay? The Decembrist revolt, which is a bunch of people trying to fight against the old ways coming back. You've got the Congress of Verona, which is another type of Vienna meeting, trying to figure out what to do now. You've got a revolution. All right, some of these are in France and some of these are in other places. You've got a reform bill where you've got basically government saying, well, obviously the common people are angry about things and they don't want to go back to exactly the way it used to be. So in 1832, you've got a reform bill that's supposed to help basically fund better care, better resources for the middle class. We've got the Factory Act that's supposed to help create a better system for peasants. And we've got the Poor Law, which is supposed to help create almost a type of welfare, though I hesitate to use that word because it's such a modern word. All right, but basically there's some bills that are intended to by Europe to put out in multiple nations to try to keep the conservative monarchies in power while giving a little bit to the people who were given so much by Napoleon and which has now been taken away again. Okay. Chartist movement, that's another basic rebellion against the old order. We've got this thing called the Mines Act, basically trying to get people who are rebelling about the bad mining conditions back into the mines. Corn laws has to do with, obviously, food. Again, you could read about this stuff. The reason why I'm showing you all these is to show that this is an incredibly volatile era. Okay, incredibly volatile. This is not just, oh, for the next 40 years after Napoleon is put in prison and then eventually dies there, we're going to have a nice, easy return to the way things were. In reality, what's going on is you've got a long line of people who are fighting for change in Europe. So it's a very turbulent time in Europe, okay? This is really why I show this chart. There's the February Revolution in France in 1848. That, I believe, I could be wrong, so some of you guys that are familiar might know more. I believe that that's supposed to be the Les Mis era. It's just kind of showing you the great unhappiness in that musical Les Mis, but I could be wrong, okay? And then finally, we have even more groups of people meeting trying to stop rebellions, okay? So this is a very turbulent time. That's the real point of all this, and there's a good timeline in your book that lays all this out. Okay, so here you go. Let's jump in. Conservatism, basic tenets, reaction against liberalism, alternative to the violence and terror of the French Revolution, which was deemed as the worst moment of liberalism in Europe by these guys. The supporters of conservatism want the restoration of legitimate monarchs, and so support will come from nobility and peasants, but not from the middle class, okay? Keep that in mind. The middle class, who are part of the merchant elite, lawyers, business owners, like the bourgeoisie as well, wealthy and less wealthy, are interested in change because liberal change was what gave them more of a say, okay? These people who are into this, into conservatism, love order and stability and tradition and theocracy. They love the idea of religious governments running the show. And this might be similar today. I don't know. That would be an interesting research assignment here in America. If you look at the poor classes versus the middle classes versus the wealthy classes, who supports liberalism the most, who supports conservatism the most, and what would that be here and why? That might be very interesting to study. I'm not really sure how to do that yet, but maybe we should think about it. The conservative hates the idea of change, of a revolution, hates the concept of Napoleon, hates the concept of any kind of progressive, unique ideas, okay? They don't like social contracts. Social contracts are where people get rights and they kind of don't want it. So what they believe, history and God were the sole sources of legitimate power. My argument, by the way, for why the peasants are going to really support the nobility is that the peasants are largely taught in churches, and churches are going to, at the time, mostly support conservatism, and so conservatism is going to be the thing that's taught by the conservative church elite, and who are coming back to power as a result of conservative rule returning to Europe again. So I think maybe in this case the poor who do not have an overabundance of education in Europe at the time are going to be taught again by people who tell them what God wants, and what God wants, according to the conservative elites, which includes the government, right? The traditional monarchies, is going to be, of course, a return to this. People that supported this, Edmund Burke in England, every king ever born, and of course the philosopher known as Hobbes, who John Locke liked to fight against a lot. Okay. Moving on, what is classic liberalism? Aha! Inquiry, right? Knowledge, learning, so to speak. Not always for the good of the people, often for the good of certain classes. So basically, believe that the individual is a self-sufficient being. Think about your John Locke here, okay? This is the ism of the middle class and the bourgeoisie, which is like the very upper middle class. They favored a written constitution and loved the idea that rebellions are a thing that people should be allowed to do to make sure that they're free of tyrannical governments, okay? These guys, again, because they're the middle class and the trading elite of Europe, they love the idea of free trade, Adam Smith-style philosophies of trade, laissez-faire, get the government out of business, that sort of thing, okay? And they loved education because within education, you can teach people to like things beyond that what you're told in church or by the conservative elite in speeches. So that's basically it. Okay, Romanticism. This is a very interesting thing. Romanticism, let me try to be clear here. Romanticism is largely a group of people who start as an active group of liberals and conservatives together, basically being in this one faction. I don't know how to describe that at all in modern day politics, but if we thought about it, I suppose we could. But basically, you've got some people that come together who basically say, you know what, we don't want to get involved in politics. All right, we want to snooze politics for a while. We're tired of it. We're tired of the fighting. We're tired of the anger. We're tired of all the people saying, oh, we got to have change, or no, we must go back to the old ways. And they just want to get out. Okay? They just want to look on Facebook. They're the people that snooze everybody who argues about politics and then just post cat and dog videos. Right? These are those people. And so romantics are going to basically be bringing back old philosophies. They like the idea of romanticizing the past, which is part of what they're doing. They also like the environment. They want to get out of the industrializing cities and out of the fighting and out of the arguing and just go hang out in the woods. They a lot of the romantics had money. They were part of the bourgeoisie that's just trying to get out of the arguing for a while, and so they're going to spend money on cabins and specialized hunting lodges and just get away from society. When you look at old films or videos or whatever that talk about the rise of, say, occult studies in this period, it's mostly these guys. All right, it's these guys who are doing, wealthy people getting together and doing seances, and people like this who are getting together and helping to fund Moulin Rouge style circuses and bohemian pursuits. People like this who, again, gather and do romanticized things. One of the most famous, which Disney castles are based off of often, is this one, the building of an actual castle. Nobody needed castles anymore. Castles didn't work in the 1700s because, cannons. And so the deal is that we have this castle that's built on this beautiful lake in the mountains, and it's a retreat for romanticists to go and hang out in this fantasyland castle, right? It's that sort of thing. And when you look at paintings, all right, the paintings often include people, but you don't ever see the faces of people in romanticist paintings. They're usually looking at something or doing something within nature. I'll show you a painting of that in a minute, all right? But romantics like to have some humans involved in the environment, and so humans are there in nature, but they like to focus on the nature part of humans being in nature when they did their art. So I'll show that to you in a second. So going down the slide, you've had a chance to look at this and can pause my annoying voice and read this. But basically, you've got feeling and emotion over reason. That's an important part of this, bringing emotion back, getting out of conservative and liberal fighting. Okay, they don't like the idea of progress and universal laws. Because they believe that you can't really make laws that are going to last for a long time, because things always change. Every new generation brings in new needs and new wants and new technologies, and therefore you just can't have one set of rules that lasts forever. So they basically say, why have them at all? All right, they're not quite anarchists, but you could bring an anarchist and a romanticist together, and they'll probably get along just long enough to have a couple of beers. Okay, so just keep that in mind. These guys often don't like the ideas of things like industrial fat cats, industrialism, slavery, that sort of thing. They just wanted to get out of change and escape. Okay, and so this is a classic romanticist picture. All right, there's a lot of these. And here's this guy, and he's a bourgeoisie. He's got money. All right, there's this guy who's standing on a rock looking at this kind of oceanic view on the coastline, and the ocean is spraying up, and the wind is going into the guy's hair, and he's staring, much like my dog does, into the horizon majestically. And so this is all you see. This is it. There's nature and the glorification of the turbulence of nature, and there's a guy in it. So it's not like you're looking at nature. You're looking at nature, but there's a dude in there experiencing nature in some way. Okay, so that's a very romanticist concept. Okay, moving on. All right. How about them French? There's a group of French that we know as utopian socialist. This might be closer to Bernie Sanders than anything else. I'm not sure if you can make that direct claim, but if there's anything that's similar to what utopian socialism is, I think it's Bernie, but whatever. So it's rooted in a reaction to the evils of the Industrial Revolution. By the way, that's our topic when we come back from spring break is Industrial Revolution. These guys believed in government economic planning. Okay, they wanted the government to run the show. They hated the idea of robber barons who would make a bunch of money for themselves and collect all the money at the top, 1% of the 1% or whatever, right? They thought that pure capitalism was what allowed evil people to rule less powerful people, was basically how that worked. And they don't believe in private property. So or they don't believe that people should just be able to collect as much as they want. So they're socialists in the sense that they believe that the ownership of private property should be regulated by some kind of committee or board or socialist government. Okay, so here's the first guy I want to mention within this system, Henri de Saint-Simon, 1760 to 1825. This guy's around for a while. All right, and he proposes, this is just an idea of what utopian socialism would look like, proposes that the captains of industry, scientists, engineers, and industrialists should be in charge of the economy. That these are the people that know what they're doing. All right, these are the people that are kind of at the forefront of industry and the forefront of trade and the forefront of creation. Of things that people need, as opposed to putting old noble people in charge like always before. All right, so basically he wants to put the bourgeoisie, if you will, in power. Okay, he thinks that they're the ones that can run a country better than the old guys, the old monarchies. The public should own the means of production, though. So you put these guys in charge, but they're not the ones that own the companies. They're not the ones that own the factories, all right, because then you've got an elite that are in charge of everything, like a general capitalistic American style system or British style system. And so he believes that the public should own the factories, and therefore you've got the people that plan and create and give us the idea for what we should be doing, right? And the public who are working in the factories and working in the fields and working for society, they're the ones that actually own all those factories and property. So you've got this balance, is what he thinks, between the captains of industry and the general public, who are the labor class. Okay? And then he will call monarchies, the aristocracy, the church, parasites. Believes that they should be kicked aside, that they no longer have a role in modern society. Okay? Mostly because they get a salary just for existing as opposed to actually doing anything. Okay, how about this guy, Charles Fourier, 1772 to 1837. What does he believe as an example of French utopian socialism? He believes that people should be in types of communes, if this sounds familiar with socialism or even communism. Believes that everybody in a country should basically be put into communes containing about 1,620 people. This is an interesting number he came about, all right? And that these communal societies, this is where if you go all the way into this, you get the word communism, that communal societies would be where people worked at what they were interested in, and because they were interested in that kind of labor, they were going to be doing well at that labor, and they'd be, happy with themselves and what they were creating, right? And then wanted total emancipation for women. So this is a very progressive person in that sense, and saw marriage as a form of prostitution. That basically he wanted women to be as equal as men, and one way to achieve that is to get rid of marriage, because marriage was how women would basically be given the safety of working with a man who owned property or working with a man whose name she took. Right, and so basically, women in much of Europe did not have any legal status unless they were married to somebody. So he says, let's just get rid of marriage, and that'll be the first step into freeing women. And in some ways, he's not wrong. All right, it's just that this is from a very period version of what this means. Okay, one last guy or a couple of people here, Louis Blanc. 1811 to 1882, creates this society, kind of like a labor union called the Organization of Work. All right, And he proposed social work stops that are supported by the state, where laborers will work for themselves and what they need, and there will be no private capitalists involved. So basically, a state-controlled labor system that's about as close to Marxist communism without being Marxist communism that I think you can get. And then, right, that's that guy. And then finally, we have this guy who's kind of interesting. Robert Owen, he's in England, all right, in industrializing capitalist England. And Robert Owen is going to basically take some of these French utopian ideas and put them into a business place. And so you may have heard of this in the United States. Henry Ford is going to be our version of a Robert Owen. Okay, and so he's going to experiment with something with the laborers of his factories. Robert Owen is he's a industrialist and cotton lord. Basically, when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, a big part of that is the production of cotton into cloth. That was what made England a huge industrial empire, because everybody needs cloth, and cotton is a very good, strong cloth to make your clothing out of, especially in a time of heavy factory labor. And so cotton, it's also lighter and breathes better than wool does, and so cotton was all the rage. It was also used for sails, and so for sails for ships, I mean. And so basically, people really wanted cotton, and the British factory system was a massive global producer of cotton. That cotton came from both India and America, by the way. And so he has this idea in his cotton factories in England. He thinks that mills and the way people who worked for him were bad working conditions, and he wanted to make things better. So he's a little bit of a philanthropist, okay? And he's going to create a type of community. It's a factory town, okay? Just like Henry Ford will make. And it's a factory town where people who work at his factories live in a town. It's almost like when you go to certain outdoor malls now, like the Irvine Spectrum, for instance, and the Irvine Spectrum is surrounded by all kinds of apartments that are also owned by people that kind of help to invest in the Irvine Spectrum. And there's places like this all over. So there's the Central Market and Entertainment region, and then there's all these places around it, right? And then nearby are all the places where these people work. The financial and business home offices all throughout Irvine. It's almost that kind of idea. Not really quite the same thing, but here we go, right? So there's this guy who owns a town or builds a town around his factory. That town has apartments. It has a business place in it. And basically everybody that needs to buy stuff for their day-to-day life can buy it in that town at set prices, as opposed to going into London or something like that, right? He has schools in this town, so the kids can, and daycares, right? So that kids can go to daycare or school while the workers are working. That takes a huge mental stress and financial burden off of the working class. He has relatively high wages compared to what people were paid at the time, so that these people could afford to buy what they needed to be happy and to survive. Of course, the benefit is that they're spending that money inside of the factory town, which means that he's going to be able to keep that system going. Reduced work hours, so that people spent time working but also had time off, and that allowed them to be happier and to work harder during those hours. Corrective vice against drunkenness, so he tried to basically bring in a type of prohibition. Schools, as I mentioned, housing, as I mentioned, and stores, right? So he's a social reformer. This is kind of like a guy with the money who's trying to fix society by creating a factory town that hopefully will have a better system of production by having the people be a bit happier in it. And they're not fending for themselves as much as they work in this system. So that's what he's done. And again, people in the United States, some of the major robber barons in the United States are going to copy this system and bring it here, and they're going to be famous for it. Again, Henry Ford was one of those people. Okay, so Robert Owen is basically what happens if you take a capitalist system in Britain and mix it with a little bit of utopian socialism. You get an interesting kind of capitalist manufacturing system that protects the worker, if you will. So we wanted to mention that guy, Robert Owen. All right, now this one gets fun. What about nationalism? Oh my gosh, all right. Nationalism is when you have a group of people who are suddenly coming together and saying, we are this group of people and we need to defend ourselves and we need to be joined together as a nation. And we're tired of anybody else saying we cannot be. I want you to think about what country or what ethnic group is really what I should say, are interested in this. Okay, think about who that is when we get to the early to the mid 1800s. What group of ethnic people in Europe are so used to being broken apart by other powerful nations that have come together for a little while during the Napoleonic era are now going to say, you know what, we like that. We want to continue to be together as one strong people. Who are these people going to be? All right. These same people will reject the Congress of Vienna and say we're tired of aristocrats from other places telling us what we're allowed to do. They like the idea of voting, of popular sovereignty. They promote the idea of nationalism's economic and administrative efficiency. We need a nationalist system of government. They believe that a nation, like a person, is free and a creation of God. So a nation is like an individual, they're saying. And so here's that question. What people of Europe might begin to adopt nationalism based upon their history and the description at the top of the slide? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Say it out loud. Say it out loud. Here it is. Germany. Yeah, the Germans. There is no Germany yet, but there are the Germans. And man, the Germans are going to finally, thanks to Napoleon putting them all together into one province for a while, they start to come together and say, dang it, we need to create our own society finally. All right, so here we go. Herder is the father of German nationalism. That's his name, Herder. And he's going to write this book. These guys always write books. Ideas on the philosophy of history of mankind. And he creates this term, the Volksgeist, right? The spirit of the people. Volksgeist is the spirit of the people. We need to increase and bring together the spirit of the people who will one day have a nation. Okay, he's a nation builder. Common people is where the national character existed, not in their God, not in their church, and not in their aristocracy. It's the people coming together where the national character of the Germans are. And he says that each nation should develop their own way and avoid distortions by outside influence. All right, nationalism, that's what that is, creating your own system. Did not think that German culture was better, but was different, and therefore needed to be free of the Austrians, for instance. Let's look at this guy who follows along after Herder, J.G. Fichte, all right? He wants to create a closed commercial state in Germany. He wants to make it its own commercial system and nationalist system. And so he is going to outline, I'm just boringly reading the slide because of the way this is, wants to outline a totalitarian system in which the state planned and operated the whole economy in isolationist fashions, thus protecting the national character. So this sounds a lot like the Germany that's going to exist as we get into the 1880s and early 1900s, right? Has an address to the German nation. You want to look this up in the book. I think I can click on it. What happens? It may not work in the system we're doing here. Oh, okay. Yeah, you could actually click on the slide version of this. That's also in the assignments folder, and you could read this thing. But let's look at it. Address to the German nation, 1807. Love that is truly love, and not a mere transitory lust, never clings to what is transient. Only in the internal does it awaken and become kindled, and there alone does it rest. Man is not able to love even himself unless he conceives himself as eternal. Apart from that, he cannot even respect, much less approve of himself. So anyway, this is the kind of philosophy that goes into this, right? Now let's come down here. Any kind, and moreover, cannot love a father. He who does not first regard himself as eternal has in him no love of any kind, and moreover cannot love a fatherland. You've heard that phrase before, that word before, fatherland, a thing which for him does not exist. So he's talking about the kind of person that would be a good German, right? Someone who loves himself and conceives of himself as something bigger than himself, right? The noble-minded man will be active and effective and will sacrifice himself for his people, the character of the Volksgeist. All right, so anyway, you can read through this. Maybe I'll give you an assignment on it at some point. All right. There was an indiscernible German spirit, he says, primordial, to be kept pure at all costs, the inner moral universe. German spirit, therefore, is better than others, right? Born through all this fire that the Germans have been through over time. All right? So a little bit more. Father Jean? Somebody who speaks German can tell me how to pronounce that. Known as the father of gymnastics. You're going to hear about this when we talk about the Nazis, all right? I'm not saying he's a Nazi. I'm saying that the Nazis borrowed his idea, right? So this fellow says, well, one way that we can get all the people together is to get all the kids together and have them all training together, basically improving their physical condition, which will improve their spirits, all right? And so he creates a youth movement. Again, this is something that Hitler is going to borrow from in the 1920s and 30s. Is this idea that nationalism can be taught to youth who are sent to camps like summer camps, and they will be training themselves to be strong Germans, eventually militant Germans. But while they're training and becoming strong and learning skills, those children are also going to be taught over and over and over what it means to be a proper German. So this kind of youth movement is a great way to teach people to be young nationalists. All right. In these camps, this is also very similar to what the Nazis did. A suspicion of foreigners will be taught to these young Germans. Who is not German, no matter where they're born? If they were born in Germany, who's not truly possessing of the German spirit? Well, Jewish people, aha, because Jewish people come from a different place. They are not German. And internationalists, people from other nations, are not German, they say. And they believe that Jews and foreigners will corrupt the purity of the German people. So German purism begins way back here. And you'll start to see it really get strong during World War I. And you're going to see it get really strong when the Nazis take over. So in a way, the Nazis are just like a very radical version of what we're looking at here, the beginning of German nationalism. Okay? We want to keep that in mind, that it starts somewhere. All right, so 1810, Polacks, right, Polish people, the French, priests and aristocrats and Jews are Germany's misfortune. These are all the people in 1810 that the German people are going to learn to not like much. Okay? There's organized book burnings to purify the German spirit. And the beginning of Grimm's fairy tales. And those fairy tales, that if you've ever heard any of them, all have to do with kind of Germanic kids fighting against some evil. Usually an evil that has to do with a foreign presence or a Jewish presence. All right? Of course, finding your spirit. Hansel and Gretel and Cinderella. Good ones. All right, Frederick List, all right, advocated free trade zones within German states, right? We should create a Germany, and within Germany you should have a bunch of trading happening that basically is like their version of NAFTA, right? Some kind of free trade agreement that's not overtly taxed between the different German provinces and whatnot. Basically, he wants to create a country. All right? All these guys really want to create a country. So here's the last one. We're almost done. Thank God, right? We'll talk about Marxism as we get back from spring break too, however we do it, all right? Because that's transitional into the Industrial Revolution. This is the most radical of all the different isms that come out during this time, all right? So Karl Marx is in the factory system of Russia. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who's going to work with him, believe that the factory system has basically become an evil, horrible thing. And he believes that there's only one way to get rid of all those factory owners and all those aristocrats and all those wealthy people who basically keep the common people down. How do you deal with people like the Carnegies? How do you deal with people like those that own the big steamship companies in Britain, like Brunel or White Star Lines, right? How do you deal with people who basically own everything, own 4% of the wealth of a nation, and don't allow the rest of the labor force to ever have any of it, right? How do you deal with that? So here we go. He creates this philosophy called dialectic materialism, which he believes explains the traditions and trends in all of human history, all right? Believes that all change only comes through types of rebellion. People have to fight to make change happen. It doesn't happen on its own, Okay? Historical development is the result of conditions created by the interaction of these forces between basically human history and what humans generally do in cyclic patterns and through clashes between different groups of people. And that's how change is made. The economy, he believes, is the cause of all struggle between people, no matter what. It always has to do with those that have, those that work, and those that do not have. And then finally, human history is a story of struggle over resources between the haves and the have-nots, right? Those are his major tenets. You could pause this here if you want to write this down. All right, moving on. Obviously believes that there's a fight between the monarchs and nobility. Also believes that the nobility are in a constant fight with the upper middle class, the bourgeoisie. Believes, of course, that the bourgeoisie are always in a fight with the rest of the middle class, which is just the common people. Proletariat simply means the common people. So if we're all Marxists, we would say that all the students at OCC are the proletariat, something like that. All right? So we're not going to go much beyond this slide with this because we're going to do a lot more about Marxism as we move forward, since it leads into huge changes throughout Europe over time. So Marxist socialism, the theory of surplus value, okay, surplus value. And he believes that the capitalists basically steal the surplus value that the labor class makes. So the labor class makes things, and the value of the labor class is basically hoarded, like toilet paper during the coronavirus epidemic by the wealthy class, right? So he believes that it's only natural that over time, the entire world is going to have to become communist, that the common people of the world are going to have to one day take over their value, understand their value, and that they're going to have to retain their value for themselves instead of giving it away to the captains of industry and the nobility and the bourgeoisie and all that stuff, basically the rich people, right? He also believes that history is predictable. If you just study it, you can tell that in the future it's going to change to communism in his own belief, okay? Capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction. That's a Marxist phrase that I think people like to repeat a lot. The bourgeoisie will exploit the proletariat, the common people, until class consciousness rises amongst the workers and destroys capitalism in favor of a dictatorship of the common people, right? So you notice he's not talking about a free society that's going to be created by the people. He's talking about a dictatorship of the people that rule everything. What does that look like? Well, I guess you could ask the Bolsheviks. All right? Wants to get rid of class in society and wants to work, people should work only to one's ability, making what people need to have, not taking more than what people need, not hoarding things. And basically the state would control what that is. So some of the French utopian socialists would probably agree with Marxist socialism, at least up to a point. All right, so Marx is not working in a vacuum here. All right, Marx is not inventing the idea of socialism and even eventually communism in a vacuum. He's doing it alongside a lot of other people who have different ideas about how this might work in a modern industrialized society. How do you give power to the people, basically? All right, he writes his famous Communist Manifesto in 1848, calls for a revolution. It's the same year that there's a revolution, another one in France and in Prussia. So there are people fighting throughout Europe over this time period. And so one of his contributions to this era is writing this call for revolution through the Communist Manifesto. And so he says this: the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. Workers of the world, unite. I don't know if you've heard any of this before, but these are all his terms. So the textbook will have a lot more about it. You've got, of course, some assignments based on that. And I'm going to leave off here with this because we'll talk more about Marx later. But now you have an idea, I hope, of the different kinds of, economic and political strifes that are breaking out throughout Europe. This will make even more sense, of course, when we start to talk about the Industrial Revolution and where that lies within this era. Okay? So thank you very much if you listened to this whole thing. I hope it helped a little bit, and enjoy spring break.